That's My Vinyl Answer interviews are brought to you by Make a Difference with Records. Based in Godalming, Surrey, we sell second-hand records and donate all proceeds to the charity Catalyst, who are best known for their mental health work. You can find out more about us at makeadifferencewithrecords.com. This is part 2 of an interview in April 2024 with Tim Bowness, and is available both as an audio podcast and on our YouTube channel, That's My Vinyl Answer. We'd like to thank Tim for the generosity of his time and Matthew Johns Associates for hosting the interview. My name's Anthony from Make a Difference with Records, and we're here for part 2 of this podcast with Tim Bowness. And we're in now, we've talked in the first part, Tim, about your own writing and what drives you to write music and the emotions that drives you in a lot of that. We're now really here to talk about musical influences, including some very early musical influences on you.
Yeah.
So, first question, hopefully it's an easy one. What was the first album you bought, and do you still have it?
Well, yeah, I've got it. Not the exact same copy, sadly, but I'm kind of confused. I suppose the first albums I bought, it depends what you mean. I was bought albums by my parents.
Okay.
And I demanded, I think, things like, John Barry's soundtrack. So I had John Barry's Greatest Hits and John Barry's soundtrack to Only Live Twice. And then, obviously, the Jeff Love Orchestra do the James Bond theme. So,
yeah,
not varied, but fantastic.
So those you were given.
Those I was kind
what
of
about your
given,
pocket
but
money?
I loved them. In terms of pocket money, what did I first buy? Well, the first single that I really fell in love with was probably This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us by Sparks.
Sparks, yeah, remember that.
But I don't know why. I didn't know what a record shop was, so I didn't buy it. But then about a year later, I fell in love with I'm Not in Love by 10cc.
Yeah.
And so I bought that as a single.
Okay.
And the original soundtrack, which is here, which is the original soundtrack, this was something that was amongst the first albums I ever bought. And I found this in a local spa, bizarrely enough.
Oh, really?
Even spas used to sell music. And they used to have this stand
chemists
outside.
used to sell music. Boots used to sell
music,
if you remember.
I remember Boots.
And Woolworths.
And Woolworths. And W. Smiths, of course. You're not forgetting W. Smiths. Although they're starting to sell vinyl again.
They are. Only the
which is good.
top 10 or top 20.
Only, about 10 albums.
Yeah.
But they're still doing it, which is good. And I remember finding this, probably along with Mantovani and his Music of the Mountains, on the outside of the spa in Stockton Heath.
So was that the first album then as well?
That was not first? Sadly, this is because I unfortunately, like a lot of people, I remember in late 80s, early 90s, I got rid of almost all my vinyl and got CD replacements.
Like a lot of people.
And I only kept the vinyls that I'd actually made myself and that I was on.
So you don't have the singles you bought. Was it, just to be clear, was it Sparks or 10cc? Which was the first one?
It was
or
10cc was the single.
Okay, that was the first
Not
one.
In Love, and the B-side, Good News. And again, because I bought it, I play the A-side and the B-side to death. Absolutely adored them.
And the first album?
Now, first album was in the summer of '76. I would say it's like we were playing
Good year for music.
Sabutio.
That's the year Wind and Wuthering came out, as I remember.
Very good indeed, yeah. And basically, people were getting a bit bored of my collection, which at that point just consisted of 10cc, Beatles, Wings, and John Barry.
Okay.
And so
heavy on the melody.
Heavy on the melody, yeah. And I still love that stuff. I will even defend Wings to the death. Even Back to the Egg.
Depends which album we're talking about, but yeah.
London Town, what a classic.
Band on the Run is my favourite.
Band on the Run is great. I absolutely adore it. And obviously, again, Wings and the Beatles I probably got into as a result of the Live and Let Die soundtrack.
Ah, okay.
So this was the key. It was
anyway. I'm digressing. Both of us.
But a friend brought in cassettes that his dad loved.
Yeah.
And we were all about 11, and he had these things like Tangerine Dream, Vangelis, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin. Okay. And only a couple of us were blown away. Most of the people thought it was tedious.
Yes.
But myself and at least one of the others.
Some people still do.
Some people still do. Were absolutely blown away. And I remember thinking, Phaedra by Tangerine Dream, Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti, and one of the other ones, I'm trying to think, Mike Oldfield's Hergis Ridge. But the one that really, really gripped me and I kept on putting back on, it was on a cassette, was Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. This was this enigmatic, atmospheric, utterly mind-blowing to me as an 11-year-old. And so, when I could afford this with pocket money, I went and bought Wish You Were Here. Now this is a new edition that is unopened.
Okay.
Whereas my original edition, I opened, poured over the artwork, the postcard, everything, and became quite obsessive about it.
But you got rid of when CDs came in.
But I did get rid of when CDs came in, but I bought it again, and I do have at least 2 special CD versions of it as well that I've still got. So this is one of the rare albums that I've got about 3 versions of.
Right. Well, that's what I guess what you call a cool choice, isn't it? A lot of people's first albums are something really kind of quite embarrassing, like Johnny Mathis or.
Well, you could include it. It depends, because it's whether you include my parents buying.
No,
what
you bought yourself. So that's good. So those were the first things you went out to buy. Wind the clock forward now to where we are today, and then we come to the impossible question. But just in your mood today, if I said to you, "Place is on fire, Tim. You've got one album you can save by another artist," what would it be? What would that favourite album be?
It's really difficult, and often it's 2 albums by the same artist. So The Hissing of Summer Lawns and Hejira by Joni Mitchell, which I constantly come back to. I mean, they're albums that I will play a few times every year, and I know them intimately. And I think that one of the reasons is because the lyrics are so sophisticated that I hear new things in them every time. And certainly with an album like Hejira, she's got relatively simple structures and relatively stripped down recordings.
Yes.
But wonderful musicians, Jaco Pastorius being one of them, that again I hear something fresh in it every time.
Right.
Because there's a kind of jazz spontaneity to those albums. Hissing of Summer Lawns is kind of slightly sweeter, but also slightly more bitter. So Hissing of Summer Lawns is one of those albums that is incredibly diverse, will go from pop to ballad to something very experimental and near atonal. You know, the Jungle Line as an example.
Yeah.
Whereas Hejira, to a certain extent, it's more the mono mood.
Right.
But it's such a rich mono mood, and I guess that when I was doing albums like Late Night Laments or Together with Stranger, in the back of my mind, I've always got Hejira there, because those were also albums that perhaps operated within a more limited emotion and more limited atmosphere.
Yes.
But I hope there's enough detail, spontaneity, to continue to interest people. It's between Hejira and Hissing of Summer Lawns, and I brought my vinyl copy of Hissing of Summer Lawns.
Excellent. Okay, so favourite album. Equally difficult question, given that there's an awful lot of.
Sorry, I thought that was the question.
No. It was the question. There's a related question, which is probably just as difficult, given how important artwork is to vinyl in particular. But if you had to pick one album from an artwork perspective, what would that be and why?
Well, my favourite designers, Hypnosis, who did the Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Tennessee sleeves. And then Peter Saville's work for 4AD, especially for Joy Division, I loved his sleeves. And then I was very drawn to 23 Envelope, who did sleeves for 4AD, so this Little Coil, Cocteau Twins. So they're amongst my favourite pieces of art. But as I've got it here, I suppose, this is a wonderful example of artwork. Wish You Were Here, Dark Side of the Moon. In that there is so much detail that kind of complements the music. So I think that basically music, lyric and sleeve really dovetail into something special when you're talking about an album like Wish You Were Here. Okay,
so Wish You Were Here, favourite album cover. We then get on to, again, I think it's a difficult question for a musician, particularly like yourself, where you've worked with so many people over such a long period of time. But if there was one artist that you've been told you've got 6 months to live, and you said you're going to do a collaborative project, and you can pick one artist. You can go back in time. You can pick an artist who's no longer around. What is the one artist you would most like to collaborate with, and why?
You see, I would want the one band. I'd expand that.
Sure.
I would say that really what I'd want is an album produced by Brian Eno.
Okay.
And Brian himself will be providing textural keyboards as well as me.
Right.
But then we'd have Jaco Pastorius on bass. Miles Davis would be on trumpet.
Oh, this is brilliant.
Guitar, actually I always thought, other than Fripp, somebody like Steve Howe was an astonishing guitarist.
Yes,
and I would
indeed.
love to hear him in a very different context, because he is such a brilliant guitarist who manages to be roots, ethereal, and quite expressive. He can manage to be all of those things. And so I'd love to put him into a very different context. Amazing guitarist. Trying to think who else I'd have in that. Drummer is the difficult one. In contemporary terms, there's an amazing jazz drummer called Brian Blade.
I don't know him. What's his background?
He's worked as a session player for people like Joni Mitchell, but he's also got his own jazz bands.
Yeah.
He's, stunning instrumentalist. Bill Frisell's another great guitarist who I think, a little like Steve Howe, manages to combine roots with something experimental and ethereal. They've got, and what I mean by roots is something that they've got this kind of earthy playing that you can hear is almost rooted in the earliest of country or rock and roll, but they take it to the cosmos. Bill Frisell does that for me as well as somebody like Steve Howe. So maybe Brian Blade, but then there's a Norwegian drummer called John Christensen who I always thought was stunning, and he worked with Eberhard Weber. So actually, would I have Eberhard Weber as my bass player?
You're going to need a bigger studio at this rate.
Yeah. Got 2 bass players, 2 drummers.
Yeah.
Because obviously, for groove drumming, I always thought somebody like John Bonham was unbeatable in terms of just having this monolithic beat.
And are these guys all playing music you've written on your own, or are you collaborating with them from a music?
It's a combination, basically. I've written the music and I'm telling them what to do.
Perfect.
Brian is then being a bit of a sounding board.
Okay.
And then I'm saying, you know what? Let's just make a noise together and see what happens.
So a bit of jamming?
Yeah.
See what comes out?
So it's 50% me being the great dictator, 50% jam.
Wake up, Tim. Wake up. Sounds brilliant. And what about live performances? If there was only one live performance that you could see, again, you can go back in time to perhaps concert that you wish you'd seen. And
well, there are certain concerts in history. Like I'd love to see the very first performance of The Rite of Spring, Le Sacre de Printemps, however one pronounces that in French, by Stravinsky, because this apparently led to people walking out of the theatre because they didn't consider it to be music.
Right.
So that would be amazing to witness. And it would be amazing to witness the kind of 60s psychedelic shows of Velvet Underground and Pink Floyd.
Yes.
When they were making their music at the most raw and inspired.
Yeah.
That would be incredible. And I never saw, say, Miles Davis or John Coltrane live, so those would have been great gigs to have seen.
And watching it just on a video, it just doesn't give you that sense of presence and atmosphere. I kind of find it quite frustrating quite often watching live concerts on video. You just don't get that feel. No. I can deal with them on record.
Yeah.
But I sometimes find watching them, I'm kind of, because I'm not there.
I think there's a physical presence. When you're at an actual gig, you can sometimes feel the music physically move you.
Particularly with all the bass pedals that people use these days.
Yeah. So there is a very different experience. And I agree that, kind of watching videos, DVDs, YouTube, and especially if you like, iPhone recollections of gigs, it's a very poor substitute for the real thing. And I'm sure that, if you're in that 1966, 1967 club, seeing Pink Floyd and Velvet Underground before they've made their name, there's an energy, a sense of danger, and a real physical transportation as well.
Yeah, because a lot of bands in that era using the infamous Mellotron that would break down regularly and not work, but hey ho. So we get on to the meat, I guess, of the questions that we always ask people. So as you know, Tim, we partner with Charity Catalyst, whose principal work as a charity is in the area of mental health. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons we ended up partnering with them was that we felt there was a strong connection with music and mental health. Certainly, personally, I use music in many different ways, depending what mood I'm in. And so we wanted to do that. Apart from raising funds, we wanted to do something which kind of tried to bring more music to more people.
Yeah.
So it became more accessible. And so what we thought we'd do is we'd ask the people we interviewed from their own personal experience, what are the albums that have meant most to them in that context, or what albums do they think might be good ones for people to look up? For example, they just want a complete escapism, just want to get away from the world, or maybe a quiet reflection, or whatever it might be. So we've asked you to kind of pick 3.
Okay.
What have you come up with?
Well, it's such a difficult question because, when I was sort of 15, I was sort of surrounded by a lot of kind of family death and mental illness. So, my mother was killed in a car crash when I was 15. My grandfather, who I was very close to, died within about 7 months of that.
Yes.
My grandmother, who lived next door, had a series of nervous breakdowns. She was bipolar, and I dealt with this throughout my childhood.
Wow.
So, I'd often come home from school. So it's in the middle of kind of, absolute chaos of
Yes.
my mother, my grandfather dying. And I might come home from school and find a van in the street taking my grandmother away screaming.
Oh, good grief. Okay.
So I had, quite a lot of experience with mental health issues. And the funniest thing with her was I remember she had a breakdown and we were waiting for the hospital to collect her. Yeah. And I remember calming her down by playing Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds because she loved Richard Burton's voice.
Right.
So while she was waiting, she was just kind of listening to his voice and concentrating on the voice and goes, beautiful.
Yes.
So she would occasionally get outside of her mania just to focus on Richard Burton's voice. So I'm not recommending that as mine. But...
context, at least.
Yeah, there was a kind of context here of how music, in a way, can have an immediate impact because it calmed her down.
Yeah, yeah.
I could actually sit her down, talk to her, while she was in the middle of an extreme episode.
Yes.
As the album was on. And the album was almost like a drug.
And I know it's a completely different area, but increasingly they're finding the benefits of music with dementia as well.
That I can believe, yeah.
So it's such a powerful tool used in the right way. But
Totally.
Anyway, let me not take you away from that.
So for me, I think during that kind of period of devastation, it's interesting. Now, this is going to be a first choice, which is an absolute outlier in my tastes and what no one will expect.
Yes.
And it's partly because when you asked me this question, I thought, I'm not sure I can answer that. But I remembered this period was the only period when I went through a phase of knowing about and being immersed in heavy metal, heavy rock.
Okay.
And my partner, her mother died recently of pancreatic cancer, and it was a really sudden and brutal death. And she found that for 7 months, now she'd not really listened to music, especially in this kind of genre, since she was a child.
Right.
And suddenly she wanted to hear the music of, say, AC/DC as a great example. Here we are, Highway to Hell. And I said, well, actually, it recalled when I was that age. And in fact, this kind of came out during that period for me as well. Yeah. And I think what it is about this music is that there's no sentiment, there's no emotion in a real sense. They're great, memorable rock songs. And as a, I've always felt the Bon Scott AC/DC were inventing a template rather than a cartoon comedy band, which I think some people sometimes see them as being now.
Right.
But they were a very inventive band that created a musical template, and they did it extraordinarily well. Great pop music, great roots rock music.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about it was that perhaps it was free from an emotional charge. And I kind of then wondered when she was listening to this during her period of grief, this is what was calming her down. If I played my music, or if I played music that I adored, it immediately triggered something that led to a relapse, if you like. So I think in a way, sometimes if you're struggling, this can work.
Completely, absolutely.
Escapism.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to think. It's kind of it's funny on occasion. It's brutal on occasion.
Just forget the world for a minute, and you're just in that zone.
And I think because it's a kind of it's brutal and unemotional. So there's a brutality that maybe kind of fits with that.
Okay. Yep.
Grief. So that's a number one.
That's your first one. Number two.
This is very difficult. When I suppose I was going through my really dark late teenage phase, I think Peter Hamill's Over was, a very big album for me from being sort of 15 to 19. The Cure's Pornography, which is absolute, relentless doom and gloom.
Yeah.
equally, you know, I think the opening lyric is, "What's it matter if we all die?" And I'm sure there were teenage moments that I felt this. So I think that, you know, there's also the opposite end of the spectrum where this absolute gothic gloom. So this is where things like The Cure, Joy Division, Van de Graaff Generator, Dead Can Dance, that I was listening to in my sort of late teens, also came in. And another album from that period, so I'm throwing them in now, was Rock Bottom, which was a beautiful, fragile, bizarre album that Robert Wyatt recorded after.
I don't know that one at all. Can I say that?
It's is that one? I'm not sure whether Nick Mason produced that of the
follow-up
as well. Certainly produced the follow, but this is one that he wrote in the wake of the accident that left him wheelchair bound.
Okay.
And there's a beautiful line of, you know, your madness fits in nicely with my own and so on. But it's a really kind of fragile, emotional, desperately vulnerable album. So it's the antithesis of the AC/DC.
Okay.
In a way. So, you know, these are certainly albums that I'd have listened.
And is this one of those albums whereby you're in a dark place, and you have to stay in a dark place, and this kind of just helps you
It's almost
manage
a catharsis, to an extent, perhaps it does. But then you have, you know, I've got the opposite here again, Virginia Astley's From God's Way We Feel Secure. It's the most sedate, beautiful album that speaks of an English countryside that probably never was.
Right.
And that's another. And then equally, I find, you know, Steve Reich or Miles Davis.
Yeah.
Especially Miles Davis during his early Electric period, where he's relentless.
Yeah.
You know, once more, this is something that I find the intensity and relentlessness of the music strangely helps me relax in certain moods. It shouldn't, because it's frenetic, but it's what I'll listen to almost to relax and wind down because of its relentlessness. So, you know, and Miles at the Fillmore, that is unadulterated.
Yeah. Early
70s, Miles Davis, pure noise funk.
Okay. And your third choice and final choice?
This is so difficult.
Yeah, it's not meant to be easy.
So there's the Steve Reich, the ECM recordings. Actually, yeah, I'm going to go for this one. So there's Peter Hamill's Over, which I didn't show earlier, which is incredibly important.
And I know he's been a big influence on you.
Very much so. And this was, you know, it's an album that was recommended to me by a shop owner. I used to go to Piccadilly Records in Manchester, and he saw what I'd buy, and he said, "I think you'll like Peter Hamill." Because it turns out that Peter was a friend of his at university. He had a cheque behind the counter.
Had a shed load of CDs he hadn't sold.
Yeah, he part-funded the first Van de Graaff album.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then he had the cheque at the back of the shop, which was Peter Hamill paying him back.
Yes, I part-funded the last Sweet Billy Pill album, yes.
And hopefully you'll get a cheque.
Well, we may or may not. We'll see.
So at some point. And I remember he recommended, I think it was Porn Hearts, which was utter gothic gloom in the same way that Pornography was utter gothic gloom.
Yes.
And brilliant. You know, it's Hammer horror set to music in some ways. And then this was his stripped-down singer-songwriter album about the death of a relationship. But it was about everything being over. So you could death of relationship, death of people, parents losing their children to growing up.
Yeah.
And it really was a constant for me, you know, from 15 to 20. And in one of my early jobs, and it's hilarious, I was asked what I liked. And so I played this album. And the person with me, I was a work-study officer for the North West Water Authority. And so we could listen to music on the way to Blackpool or wherever we were going to study what was going wrong with the sewers in Blackpool and how people were working. And the person was in near tears listening to it.
Okay.
And the next time I went to work, I was actually called up by one of the managers saying, "Yes, you've upset one of our workers with your music. He believes you've not got over the death of your family members," and so on. And it's bizarre. I almost had a kind of, you know, it was going to be a therapy. They were going to recommend me therapy.
Okay.
I was actually in a fairly good place.
Yeah.
This was just music that I loved and that resonated with me. But I've told Peter that, and he finds it hilarious. And the other story he finds hilarious is that when I introduced my partner to his music, I played a particularly violent Van de Graaff piece.
Yes.
And she has a perfect driving record until she listened to this. And she slowly crashed into a hedge while listening to Van de Graaff Generator's Man Erg.
Really?
Because it was disturbing her so much.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So, and obviously, you know, for Peter, I think he hears these stories probably all the time of his music influencing people, probably to serial killing, I think, you know, is the extreme. So another album that really kind of I found was kind of emotionally soothing and wonderful.
Is this your number 3 then?
This is going to be my number 3, The Soft Bulletin,
Right.
The Flaming Lips. And I'd always liked the album.
Let's just take that a minute. So that's...
But when when my partner was pregnant with our child, you feel extremely vulnerable, extremely expectant.
Mm-hmm.
And it triggers emotions that either you've not had, or it triggers worries from adolescence. It's all sorts of things. It's in a maelstrom. So I found that in the pregnancy and just after, there's something in that album that really spoke to me in an abstract way that I just completely played, and it was very emotional. And it turns out that this was written at a stage for them when family members had been dying of cancer, when there were new births.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so this was interesting because I didn't really know that at the time.
I didn't know that backstory either.
I liked the album.
Yeah.
But, you know, it just became something that I just kind of gravitated towards and played a lot. So The Soft Bulletin, I don't know why, it was just one of those albums that I found explored a variety of emotions, from kind of grief to sedate beauty to absolute joy. It was that maelstrom that it represented. So The Soft Bulletin by The Flaming Lips, I guess, would be a third choice. And I would also, I think I'd recommend Black Star by David Bowie, which I brought along, because I just think this is a tremendously therapeutic and emotional album. And I listened to this when it came out, and I remember I listened to it in the dark, as you should, of course, listening to it from start to finish, and I felt slightly upset and drained, and I knew that was the last record he'd ever make. And the day afterwards, it was really bizarre, I woke up and his death was announced.
Oh, okay.
And it's funny, and although I didn't cry because, you know, this wasn't a family member, it's one of the few celebrity deaths where I felt genuinely touched and bereft.
Yes.
And someone that had meant an awful lot to me musically ever since I was at school. You know, I remember buying Low from the school board. We used to have a board of albums, and people would be selling things, and somebody had a copy of Low for something like 5p on Saudi Arabian cassette. And I adored Life on Mars, which again I found a very, you know, comforting, therapeutic, emotional song. So I bought Low and became obsessed with Low. So, you know, Bowie had been somebody who'd been an important figure in my music listening as much as Pink Floyd since I'd really got into music seriously. So I definitely put that in there somewhere.
So you've sneaked a fourth in there, really.
I've sneaked about 10.
You have, actually.
I wasn't
going to mention it, but...
Yeah, David Sylvian's Secrets of the Beehive.
No one will notice, it's fine. No one's going to notice.
You know, again, I think, you know, this was just utter beauty and melancholy that
So were you into Japan then as a...
Oh yeah, no, Japan were a band, again, I probably discovered partly through a friend who I still know when I was at school, and I think his brother had bought Gentleman Take Polaroids, and so we took this to our house and we listened and we absolutely fell for it. And that led us to another world of musical discovery. I think his brother was into Ultravox and Japan. And we already rather liked Gary Newman, so this kind of pushed us. So yeah, as I've said, you know, the music taste was always eclectic. So things like Pink Floyd, Genesis, yes, were always there in the background because we adored it. But equally, you know, Newman sounded like the future. So Japan. So we were in love with that sort of music as well. And the eclecticism of these artists then led us maybe to classical, jazz, folk, country, you name it. And the Blue Nile's A Walk Across the Rooftops. This is a brilliant late night album. I find,
now again, I don't know this at all.
It's almost like a portrait of desolate late night Glasgow, which seemed to fit in with my portraits of desolate late night Warrington. You know? But it's very beautiful. It's quite mournful, but it's equally uplifting.
Oh, look,
as well. There's a few gorgeous pop songs on it. So there you go. There's probably about 20 recordings there that I've recommended for certain moods, with the first being The Outlier.
Well, it's not. It might be an outlier for what people would think you'd pick, but it's not an outlier in the sense of the subject, because we were talking earlier about escapism being quite important depending where you are at a point in time. So,
completely
good choice.
But it was interesting to me that it kind of fulfilled that need when I was 15 and in a fairly desperate state, and then it fulfilled the need of my partner last year. That it was this was the recipe, and I wondered if it was that. It was, as you say, pure escapism, no emotion. In other words, don't watch John Carpenter's Starman. This is the thing.
Yeah. So we come on to the final answer from the final question. Mm-hmm. I'll try that again.
The final countdown.
Oh please. I've got that in my head now. You've said that.
Well, often myself and Michael Bear.
I really can't abide that song.
I'm not a fan. I've got to say, I'm not a fan. But before gigs, in order to get ourselves in the mood, myself and Michael Bearpark would often sing and get the rest of the band to do this. Almost barbershop quartet meets Bach version of the final countdown.
Oh my lord.
So you had everyone doing.
Did that improve the original at all or not?
It was a hit single in the making.
Okay, so final question, which brings us on perhaps rather cheesily to the final answer.
Yeah.
Which is, of all the albums that you've been involved with, either as a solo artist or collaborative form, if you had to pick one record that you think I should take back to the shop and say, right, that is what Tim thinks is most important in the context of what we're doing, what would it be and why?
Well, in the context of what we're doing, say, for mental health, I think that probably it would be No Man's Together with Stranger.
Okay.
This was an album that we recorded during a time when my dad had cancer, and a long-term relationship I was in fell apart, and so it was really recorded during a deeply emotional period.
Yeah.
And that evoked feelings of when I was an adolescent, because you find there are always echoes of these things.
Yes.
So it was a sort of deeply emotional time, and this was a really cathartic album to make.
Okay.
And I feel that it's one of No Man's best albums in a certain field. This was, we explored a set of emotions and we explored a set of feelings, and maybe we've never done it better than on Together with Stranger, in the same way that maybe we've never done Love You to Bits as well as Love You to Bits in that particular field. But yeah, so I'd go with Together with Stranger. But for your giveaway, an album that I wrote and recorded around the same time, so it had similar emotions, and I felt was equally good in a different way, was California Norfolk, that I did with Peter Chilvers. And this was one where we were both playing everything and producing everything, and perhaps it has an echo of the album that I'm about to release, in that it was very DIY.
Right.
So Peter wasn't naturally a bass player, but he was playing double bass and stick and fretless.
Right.
I was playing all the guitar on the album, so we were kind of pushing ourselves and our limited abilities, while also, obviously Peter's a great keyboard player, doing the things we were comfortable with. We were doing things we weren't comfortable with.
Yeah.
And it was quite low in terms of the number of tracks we'd use and in terms of the hi-fi nature of it, but it was a really kind of emotional, rough and ready release.
Okay.
Which operated in a similar territory to Together with Stranger. It wasn't as eclectic as, say, a Butterfly Mind or Powder Dry.
Yeah.
This was one that investigated a few moods. It was quite claustrophobic, and I really liked that. And I do think that, after making Together with Stranger and California Norfolk, I don't think I did anything good again until Schoolyard Ghosts by No Man, which I
love, I have to say.
Which is a good 5-6 years after.
If I had to pick 3 No Man albums to take out of the fire, that would be in my list.
That was a really important album as well. I adored making that album and think it's one of our strongest. But, that period, almost because it fulfilled a certain need in me, though, about 5 years of not really doing very much. And that includes my first solo album, My Hotel Year, which I always felt was not quite right and slightly cobbled together.
And I gather you've bought the test pressing.
So what I brought for you for your competition is...
Competition?
I don't know your... auction.
Hopefully people are going to buy it.
Buy it, the auction. Is the test pressing white label of California Norfolk, which has just been done and just been approved. So this isn't one that is unplayable and scratched and suffers from warps or what have you. So it's California Norfolk, white label, test pressing, of which there are probably only 3.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. No, seriously, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah.
It's been a really interesting conversation, very varied. And you know, if I had the time and you were willing, I'd stay here for a lot longer. But we neither of us have that luxury. Okay. So thank you for today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Bye bye.
That was the second and final part of our interview with Tim Bowness, recorded in April 2024. You can find interviews with other artists on our That's My Final Answer audio podcast and YouTube channels.